Okay, everybody, welcome back. This is SIC Talks number 73. I'm here with Emily Segal, who is a strategist and brand analyst and writer and artist and trend forecaster and fascinating brain. I've found Emily originally through K-Hole, I think, which was a collective that she was a founding member of in the probably early 2010s. Emily, is that right? Like somewhere in that range, who are famous for their normcore report, which coined the term and also sort of asserted, in my view, normcore into the world, but also who made a bunch of other really fascinating trend reports in that time. Chaos Magic being my favorite one. That and that amazing like diagram that was made. Which report was that for that crazy diagram that
of the brand anxiety matrix with
the brand anxiety. Yes.
Yeah, that's my favorite.
Well, in any case, so I have been following Emily since then, and she's gone on to write a novel, to do a whole series of interesting trend reports, to start a new firm called Nemesis Global, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, and then most recently start a series which is still on the A's, so you can get in early on it, but it's an A to Z of, like, let's call it brand analysis. And the first one was on a mobile gaming handset called Anbernic from China. I may have that pronunciation wrong, but which I had never heard of before, which was really fascinating. And is just, I think, indicative of like how big the world of entertainment, trend, marketing, manufacturing is. So anyway, I gave Emily a shout and said, hey, can you please come on SIC? And she was very accommodating to oblige. So anyway, Emily, welcome. Sorry, that was a long intro, but there you go.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Well, okay, so I find you in Portland. You're there because of an art show that your partner, Matt Bass, is putting on, which we don't need to dig into too much, but like how are things these days? Where does the world find you normally? Like what's
the world normally finds me in Los Angeles, where I moved right before COVID from Berlin, which was good timing, although I didn't know it at the time. And I had actually started Nemesis while living in Berlin. So my business partner, Marti Kaliala, is still based there. And then we have a strategist in New York. So we kind of straddle quite a few time zones.
Oh, got it. Okay, cool.
And I have a lot of meetings early in the morning. It also means that we're kind of open 24 hours a day, which is a blessing or a curse, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah, I mean, you guys wrote something, I think maybe in the K-Hole days, about the idea of living in Los Angeles as a means of sort of suspended animation. It was like waking up to the world already in progress, that I just thought was a really interesting sort of meditation on things. Do you still find that to be the case?
It's funny. I don't think I ever would have thought that I would have lived in Los Angeles when that report came out. That was reflecting on our member Dina Yego's experience moving to LA. It was there was a moment of mass exodus, mostly among art people, or like the people in my social cohort, to Los Angeles in like the mid 2010s. And I thought it was so stultifying because everyone was like, I hiked. And I was just like, I was like, this is so awful, like I drank a juice. Like, I just thought it was so dumb. I'm from New York. I grew up in Manhattan. So I think for a long time, I felt this very intense need to sort of stick it out. And I still think I'll always think of myself as a New Yorker. Like, I can't really imagine myself really thinking of myself as an LA person, but I ended up in LA for love, and I'm actually very happy there. But I don't really identify with the place that much, and maybe that will change. And maybe I'll live there for the rest of my life. Who knows?
Yeah, I think, it's funny. I was just, I was emailing with past SIC Talks guest, Kyle Raymond Fitzpatrick, who does a newsletter called The Trend Report that I really like, and I think not enough people pay attention to. But anyway, he was writing about how when he was in high school, he encountered the Hipster Handbook, and he used it as a Bible. And it was only just recently he realized that it was written as satire, which I thought was funny. But in any case, my response to that was to send him to a PDF of a zine that a guy named Andrew Coulter Enright wrote called How to Be Fashionable or consume like me. This was in the summer of 2003, and he published this as a little zine. And it's a whole series of axioms, which were very specific to that time period. But one of the axioms was neither love nor hate LA, tolerate LA. And I feel like that has always been I've sort of picked up and run with that. So yeah,
I think that's sane. I think that's sane. It's funny. I had a similar relationship with the book Pattern Recognition by William Gibson.
Of course, another canon.
And that's actually what made me want to get into trend forecasting. I thought like I could do that. And then only later on did I realize like, oh, this protagonist who's sort of like immense propensity for judging the value of corporate brands comes from this allergy toward corporate branding that she has. For those who haven't had the pleasure of reading the book, though she's like in immense danger and like it's consumed by anxiety and discomfort the entire time. And I didn't really like process that part of it while I was aspiring to become like the character.
That is so funny. It's an observation that I had never considered. And it's interesting because I read the book in a similar fashion, highly entertaining, highly sort of aspirational. This notion of being able to feel whether a brand is good or bad or whatever, it strikes me as like, a weirdly logical thing, like that. There's sort of metaphysical thing you can tap into, but it's a novel of geopolitical intrigue, really. And so, yeah, I guess I hadn't thought about that. And it's funny because I was just going to ask you whether you had reread it recently. I have been meaning to and have not in many years.
I read it pretty recently, like 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah.
Got it. I have a 17-year-old who I am like trying to nudge into reading more through things like that. Like, hey, the way she feels about that jacket is like the way that you feel about your neck face dunks or whatever it is, right? Like
I read that book because it was on my dad's bookshelf. So
is that right? Really?
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. I can't remember what I was recommended it by a guy named Ricky Engelberg, who is a good friend and a voracious consumer. I'd imagine you probably are of just pop culture in general, right? Like the guy's aperture is incredibly wide, and he's encyclopedic in his knowledge. And so when he said you got to pay attention to this, he'd said it in an array of probably 18 different things that I had to pay attention to, and that was probably the one that stuck from that conversation. But he was really right.
I think it's harder to be encyclopedic these days.
Yeah, well, I mean, the shape of the encyclopedia has changed, right? Like it's impossible to even pretend to know everything. So it's more like, I don't know what it's more like exactly. How do you approach that? I mean, do you then like is A to Z an attempt to sort of be encyclopedic in that way to give there some format to the notion of collecting everything?
I think it was more a way for us to create some sort of limit to the number of or selection of brands that we could possibly analyze, because there are so many. So it's related to what you're saying, but not exactly. So we were brainstorming X, Y, and Z brands that we thought would be interesting to dive into, but it seemed like sort of an illogical hodgepodge. And then we realized that if we kind of use the alphabet just as a sort of arbitrary organizing mechanism, it both like gave it a bit of structure and then inspired us to, when you had to fill in the blank for a letter that you hadn't already thought of, helped us reach for something more obscure. And like any sort of organizing principle, just assisted in the creative process in that way.
I would imagine it also is interesting because you then can go, all right, now that we've got our list of 26, we then go, all right, break down by industry. Oh, we have too many gaming companies, for instance, or we have too many petrochemicals, or we have too many sportswear companies, or we
have too many big things, or we have too many obvious things. Because like that's I feel like it's more for us about having a mix of niche things that you haven't heard of, and then surprising takes on things that you have heard of,
Yeah.
and trying to strike the right balance there so that it doesn't get too kind of hopelessly specific and niche, and also doesn't retread territory, because when I started doing K-hole, which K-hole sort of formed in 2010, which was
Mm.
where I graduated from college, but didn't produce a report until 2011. We were basically the only people doing trend forecasting for an audience, like outside of and just as content, even though we didn't think of it as content in that way.
Yeah.
Now it's like there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who do that and do it very well. And then it's also sort of the lay ability to think through commercial forms and analyze a brand has increased dramatically among regular people. So it's become a much specialized form of knowledge.
Why do you think that is? Do you think that's, I mean, I would posit that you've had some effect on that because of the sort of meta-ness of the K-hole project, and just the way it was analysis, it was content, it was art, it was provocation, all of that stuff. But also just like, what are the other macros that have driven that, do you think?
I think like the increasing commercialization of our world.
Okay.
Like the more corporate and commercialized our world became, the more obvious became that to navigate it well, you had to understand it. And then having these huge mushrooming social media platforms asking for more and more and more and more content, it's kind of just like you put the lime in the coconut and you get content about commercial culture. Like, I think that, in the same way that, teens and young people were obsessed with understanding the language of music, or obsessed with understanding the music of the logic of fashion, which are both commercial and non-commercial, depending on how you slice it.
Sure.
The more that just like the brandedness of our world increased, the more just that sort of language could be, or that sort of systematic way of thinking could be extended. And that's actually what got me into, besides pattern recognition and Case Pollard,
Right.
That's one of the things that got me into branding, because I was very, very obsessed with fashion as a young person. And I felt like I had a good intuitive grasp on what made fashion brands different, what made certain things special. And I felt like it came very naturally to me. And at some point I realized that branding was just kind of looking at the whole world that way, or trend forecasting
for sure
meant taking that filter and just applying it to anything, and not just keeping it limited to clothing, which was lucky for me also, because even then, and this is still kind of how I roll, like I have a very like finicky relationship with fashion, and like certain days just wake up and don't care at all, or like,
right. Yeah.
Can be super into it for a year or two and then wake up one day and just absolutely don't care. So like,
Yeah.
having a way to apply that same type of thinking and interpretation to a broader field meant that there was more to dig into, which was good for me.
Yeah, for sure. That sort of on-off notion, or I guess, characteristic of yours, feels like it would be one of the fueling factors to your, I don't know what, analysis of the world's ley lines, right? Like you wake up one morning and you don't care about fashion anymore. It's like, there's probably something different now that other people are feeling too. Do you, is that accurate, do you think? Or is it something else?
It's really interesting that you bring that up, because, definitely when I was younger, or definitely when we were still doing K-hole, so much of our analysis had to do with our deep personal reactions to things. And it was about trying to pay really close attention to what was calling, and I'm saying there were 5 of us in the group. So like, whatever was it's like, whatever we were noticing, whatever was distracting us, like that was the bellwether that we used to kind of drive our analysis. I think that that's still true to an extent, of course. And like, part of what drives my let's say, trend analysis or like sense of what's going on in the world has to do with like my deep intuition. But I also think there's like a certain type of porousness and vulnerability you have as like someone in your early or mid 20s trying,
Sure.
especially like living in New York, trying to navigate highly complex systems of like culture and capital, where I felt like there was a lot more that was just coming into my system, whether or not I wanted it. And the more that I've had the luxury of like making my life a nicer place to be, and sort of like also creating the type of cocooning that you need to, say, write a novel or
Right.
have a different type of practice. I don't necessarily know if I'm the bellwether. I mean, there are certain things, of course.
Oh yeah, and I wouldn't and just to be very clear here, I'm not asking you to name yourself as like the oracle or whatever, but
I didn't see it that way. I just mean
okay,
that
good.
as it was like as a methodology.
Yeah.
I think what I used to be more connected to my own sense of, or not that I'm not connected to it anymore, but I used to find my own sense of like what I was noticing to be like highly indexical of something new going on.
Sure.
And I think that like maybe less so now, and I have to rely on some other tools. And then the other part, of course, is that like the more any of us have like personalized feeds as in terms of like our digital experience, that it also kind of changes that principle, because part of what made that interesting is that if in theory we're all walking through the same urban space, or we're all like looking at the same more or less like feed of what's on the internet, then whatever we pick up on, and if that all overlaps, that's meaningful. Whereas if we all have like algorithmically personalized feeds, it doesn't necessarily have this, it's meaningful in a different way. Like what's
right. It goes from pure pattern recognition to like just relating my pattern to what I perceive to be other people's patterns in some sort of
it's
limited way.
Different. And then of course that's also one of my like big gripes with, even though I really respect a lot of, let's say, like TikTok trend forecasting and think it's like excellent, I also think there's a lot of like just naming things as trends that aren't, like,
yeah,
and being like red is a trend. I'm like,
no,
like,
no, it isn't. That's just a color. It's just a color. And it's
like,
a primary color. It's not even
really out enough of the right examples to make it seem like that, or like you can kind of tell that there's this weird people have a understandable difficulty kind of like setting the parameters for what the trend would be happening inside of to make it meaningful. And so you see this again and again with a lot of like tons of proclaimed trends that don't quite like make it over the line for me.
Well, I mean, they're written in service of, and I'm going to separate what happens within the business of that kind of forecasting, which I don't know a great deal about. I'm sort of peripheral to it, but which I would imagine is where you spend a lot of your time. There is the cores, the trends, whatever, they get named essentially to get somebody to click on a story or a picture or whatever it is. As a matter of fact, I was listening to a podcast just prior to this, the new episode of Throwing Fits, and they actually say normcore was the last real trend that wasn't sort of invented for the purposes of audience consumption. You can debate that, of course, but I did think that was sort of interesting, that it was like that was the the way some people sort of put a flag in the sand, and then everything after that is just sort of like people pointing at things and naming them, essentially. How do you how do you then think of the landscape today? And you may disagree with what I just said. I thought it was an interesting observation.
Interesting. I mean, it definitely wasn't something that it's definitely very different than how I imagine framing something as cottagecore or whatever. Like the way it was different in that sense. And also, even though it had to do with fashion, we weren't really trying to name a fashion trend. And then in the media cycle, it became much more about fashion, which was good and bad.
Yeah.
And whatever, it was a whole saga. And it was 10 years ago, which is crazy. this, or last month or 2 months ago, it was 10 years ago that it went viral. So it's really like old news at this point. But um I do think that there's like, this landscape of social media where, and of just the internet in general, where the idea is that there's more and more and more and more content. There's the idea that and then of course you're basically, people are incentivized to taxonomize and to name things and to put things in categories. And then, in the clickbait way that you're mentioning, of course, if something feels particularly on point or is particularly triggering for some reason, there are like commercial incentives to sort of get that
of course
stirred up. And then also I think that there's just like sort of like the fun of it, or the game, just trying to like name your world and taxonomize things, which I think is like, I think people can get kind of like cranky about it, but like that part is fun, and like I totally get it.
Well, it should be, right? Like it's one of the things that has always really inspired me is there's an artist, Stephen Powers, who was a graffiti writer and now a fine artist who plays a lot with words. I'm a big word art guy. Like, it's my favorite stuff. And he wrote a book called The Art of Getting Over, which is like it's a writer's history of graffiti from its early days in Philadelphia through New York. Now, I'm inspired by graffiti, but I could kind of take or leave the stuff in the book. Really, I'm just not that much of a nerd about it. But the title has inspired me forever. The Art of Getting Over is just like the sense that you can do it if you decide to do it. And then if you can get away with it, it feels so sweet. And it's so illuminatory to everything else. And so, yeah, I mean, that should be fun. That feeling should be fun. And it bums me out when people try to make it not fun,
Right. Well, I think that what also happens naturally is that, like, I'm 35. Like, when I was much younger, knowing lots of obscure stuff about fashion was a much more rare and obscure thing than it is now. And so there are like diminishing returns on certain like classes of knowledge. And that is kind of not that much fun. Or it's neither here nor there if you're a younger person just coming into the world that way. But if you invested a lot of energy into learning about something, thinking it was going to give you some like occult edge on how the world works, and then everyone and their mother knows and cares about those things, kind of like a buzzkill. But at its best, it should just be an invitation to like learn about new things. It's like people, are too into fashion, they're too into electronic music, they're too into this, that, and the other thing. And like these things that kind of used to be this like place to really like get a lot of meaning from, they start to feel like less meaningful, basically. And then I think there's like the chasing the high of like knowing about some obscure trend or knowing about something before other people know about it. And I think that, like, when we started K-Hole, it wasn't because it was coming from a place of really seeing the connection between the strategies that companies were using and the communication strategies that contemporary artists or art collectives were using, and thinking like it would be really interesting if we could kind of illuminate some of these and make them available to more people to think through. And also, trend reports as a format seem so strange and elaborate that they seem like a really fun thing to play with, because they were also something at the time like that they were these very kind of expensive documents that were hard to kind of lay your eyes on. You can see a lot more of them now because also a lot more companies, for example, will do like a public facing trend report in the same way that they would do a annual report or something. That was much less common 15 years ago. So like, the idea wasn't that we were like necessarily like obsessed with what was new and hip. Like, I think we would have found that to be kind of like a corny framing to a certain degree.
Of course. Of course.
But then like, but we were just aware of the fact that like certain things did seem to like, bubble up and indicate new strategies or new consumer behaviors. Like, my dad just got Venmo. He's like, I'm the last person in the world like not to have Venmo. And I was like, you remember that Venmo was in the first K-hole, Venmo money, Venmo problems. Like, and I remember
Oh
finding
my God.
Venmo through the website of one of their VC firms that had all of these like new companies, and like many of them, of course, would never hear about again.
Yeah.
And I was horrified by Venmo because at the time I was getting like my dinner paid for by older friends all the time. And if I had had like a way to pay them back, it would have like ruined my life. So like, it's like the worst thing. Like,
That's so
you know, like,
funny.
I don't want a way to conveniently pay people back. I wanted to be like, oh, I have to get cash, so this is hard, you know, whatever. It's like 90.
Yeah. No,
I wanted the social largesse that came with the difficulty of paying someone back, and then the idea that like you have to pay people back even for very small amounts of things, which of course, you know, we kind of take for granted now. Was just like, it really freaked me out. But it's like that was legitimately new. Like, it's obviously not new now, but it was legitimately new. Like, that was very different. The way that like we used money was different. And in this sort of Web 2 world, there was of course a lot of bullshit about what was new, and there were legitimately new things. Like,
right.
And then I think as K-hole wore on, and also like, you know, into working on Nemesis, which like riffed on some of the K-hole themes, and then also different thing, has been doing a different thing. Like, you know, I think there was a certain like fatigue around the idea of like the next big thing. That's why my favorite Samsung tagline is the next big thing is already here.
Right.
Because it's so like, it's so true a lot of the time. And it's also just like, there is something kind of that becomes a little bit like trite and tiresome about like constantly trying to name the new thing. And that's why like a pattern recognition type of model versus a like what's the brand new trend model can be like a better way of looking at it. But of course it depends on what actually.
Well, what it really is you're analyzing what the incipient trends are and trying to give some sort of sense of when they'll reach a level of momentum or critical mass where they start to be important as influences or indicators. The next big thing is already here is very Gibsonian, very much a parroting of his, you know, oft quoted, the future's already here. It's just unevenly distributed.
Totally.
Well, okay. So we ostensibly get together each week to talk about, you know, the stories that are in the SIC newsletter that I put together every week, and to just kind of understand from my guests what they're paying attention to, what they're looking at. It almost never ends up being about that. So everything we've talked about at this point has been super germane. But I do wonder, was there anything in the list of stuff that I sent you beforehand that jumped out at you as being interesting or worth exploring further?
The Tyndall trend.
Okay, so the Tyndall trend. This is an article from Jing Daily, which is the publication that covers really like luxury as its center point, but also just marketing and trends in China. And I hold on a second. Let me find this story real quick because I want to read something. So Tyndall was not a term that I was familiar with. According to the article, in science, the Tyndall effect occurs when light passes through a colloidal solution and is scattered, making the light visible. For example, when sunlight passes through the Earth's atmosphere during sunrise or sunset. So this is where the word comes from. However, Tyndall dressing seems to be just like matching your clothes. It's Tyndall style represents a much more sophisticated approach to matching outfits, and it's being presented here as a counter to dopamine dressing. Notwithstanding the fact that you might have learned that word, I certainly did. What was it that jumped out at you about this one?
I loved how obscure the source of the trend naming was. Like, you never hear the word colloidal being used, and that's like colloidal silver arrow. I mean, it's like such an obscure scientific thing. I guess what it's trying to say is that I also haven't looked at like many of the examples, but I guess what it's trying to say is that like instead of just like having like a bunch of bright, happy colors. It's trying to use some sort of like more like natural gradient of colors that come from some sort of like that could be found in nature to create a more like sophisticated but like coordinated colorful look.
Right.
So in that sense, it kind of seems like the other side of the coin from like quiet luxury or something. We've had like this very tedious, long kind of period of like things being very like taupe or like very muted, and people
Right.
kind of like endlessly trying to figure out like what's up with that. And it's like it hasn't been, and then I feel like this is trying to look at like, okay, because this is kind of just the typical dance in fashion or fashion math. It's like this, the hemlines are short, the hemlines are long, the sneakers
Right.
are chunky, sneakers are really flat and skinny. Like we kind of do this over and over again. It's a little bit less linear than it used to be because of we're living in this networked reality where things are kind of all happening simultaneously, but there's still like some of that motion going on. And so I see like a very colorful trend being the counterpoint to a very like muted trend, but this is like trying to be colorful in a sort of classy way and then using like a super obscure scientific thing as its sort of like framework, which I think is very charming. Forgive me, I'm listening.
No.
I'm just my computer as we talk.
Oh, no, it's okay. It's funny. It's interesting as a counterpoint to the idea of quiet luxury or these muted tones, the Brunello Cucinelli Loro
Yes.
Pianification of our color palettes. But we, in a funny way, this Tyndall dressing, which is about, right, as you said, kind of dressing along a gradient and or matching outfits along a gradient so that they are of the same hue or of a similar sort of dusky hue.
We think that's what it is.
Well, right, according to the article, it seems
We're not really experts yet.
Well, there's another term in here that's there's actually this amazing quote. Girls' money. This is from the article. Girls' money is so easy to earn. I haven't yet fully understood peppermint mambo, referring to a dress of trending in a mint hue. But now they've made up another word. Tyndall dressing. I'm not up on peppermint mambo either.
Peppermint mambo. I'm behind.
Well, okay, so that I mentioned off mic at the beginning that I wanted to pick your brain about something, and I'll jump into it in a second. But what I was going to say was that it feels like, to a certain degree, the idea of matching in this way in a very harmonious fashion could be similar to quiet luxury or to the muted tones, in that it is a reaction. It's an attempt to find calm in an increasingly like chaotic kind of universe. So I don't know. Maybe that's part
right,
of it.
maybe
Although
it's the quiet luxury version of colorful dressing.
yeah,
I think what's sad about quiet luxury, I mean, okay, what's not sad about it is that like who doesn't want like a gorgeous,
beautiful things,
soft, like beautifully made 4-ply dark brown cashmere sweater or whatever. Like there's like the animal appeal of like a wonderful fiber or something is obvious.
Yeah, for sure.
I think the depressing part comes from the sense of like, if you step out of the bounds of something, you're too much, or you're tacky, like this sense of like needing to sort of like ape a certain version of control to be looked at as legitimate.
Yeah.
Sort of like part of it. And it's sort of like the same girls who have this sort of like sorority idea of what it means to be like beautiful, then have like this new updated sort of like regressive limited sense of what it means to look valid, that gets put through being like not tacky, but then it's like not even really authentically not tacky because it feels very like top down or something.
Yeah. Well, it just feels contrived.
It feels contrived, and it's sort of like, of course, we also know that there's this like X factor of just like really simple elegance, but that maybe you can get, through, but that it also is like more than the sum of its parts, and certain people can really pull that off, and it's like part of someone's style, kind of like fundamentally. And then it's also like you can wear bright colors, but need to do it in this like super refined way where everything has like a deep sort of scientific relationship with each other so that you don't look too crazy or wacky or like you're having too good of a time. It's like slightly depressing, actually.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and in that there are shades of just a culture of state control and, just general like repression of the self within the system. All right. Well, anyway, let's switch gears for a second because I do want your advice on this. Okay.
Sure.
So the guys who run Jing Daily I have become friendly with them. Basically, I discovered it somehow and started citing it in the newsletter, and they got in touch, and we've been friendly. And the publisher suggested, he was like, it'd be fun for you to do a column in Jing Daily. Now, my problem with that is I've never been to China. I don't know anything about China other than what I read in Jing Daily.
Right.
And so I'm very flattered by this idea and I want to do it, but I want it to be something that's actually meaningful. And I was struck by, do you get Semaphore, the news startup from about a year ago that was Justin Smith and Ben Smith? Is it BuzzFeed?
I've heard of it, but I haven't really looked at it.
They have a recurring feature called, I think it's called One Text or One Good Text or something like that. And it is essentially like literally a picture of a text exchange between somebody from their editorial staff and somebody from, a senator or a policymaker or whatever the case may be is. And I was just like, maybe there's a way to do it where I'm asking questions of people in China who actually know what's going on. And so I guess the question for you is twofold, right? One, as a editorially minded person, does that sound interesting, or does it feel like I'm just barking up the wrong tree? And then secondly, how, if you, Emily, were a casual reader of that, but also do what you did, how do I ask those questions in a way that makes it meaningful to you or valuable?
I mean, so Jing Daily, I've read Jing Daily, but I don't really have a good sense of its like editorial mandate. It's like covering it's covering luxury culture in China mostly, right?
For Western audiences, importantly, like that's yeah.
I mean, something that I could imagine working would be like, from the perspective of someone paying, writing from America, is like trying to track where influences from China or from Asia are showing up in American culture, because that is obviously that's happening, goes without saying.
Yeah.
And then that is also something that an on the ground perspective here could elucidate. And then in terms of the conversation, I guess it just depends who you're texting.
Yeah.
Because that's what will make it like really interesting or not. So you could have a kind of pen pal, I suppose.
Yeah, well, that's actually kind of interesting. A regular exchange between, because I had imagined it as being not unlike this series where it's like a series of loosely connected people and I kind of move from one to the other. But the idea of actually like having an ongoing dialogue with somebody in that regard, asking questions and getting answers and then answering back, is interesting too.
Yeah, that could be a cool way to do it. And then you could it would be like a research project on both sides, potentially, like kind of seeing what's showing up here, what's showing up there, the way they relate to each other, not.
Well, I mean, in some respect, I hadn't thought of it until just a second, but it is something that I feel like you do a very good job of, at least as I perceive it, which is like working out loud or working in public, right? Like having the process be a part of the output and the output be, the process. And so, yeah.
Yeah, because also that's often the most engaging part. I mean, you don't want things to be like so half-baked that they're like too messy, but
right.
It often is the dialogue behind something that can be the most compelling part of how it got dreamed up. So I've definitely like experimented with a lot of different formats in terms of how to present my work. And I don't really do it in a very like calculated way, at least not lately, but but it just kind of organically has happened that way. So, and I love interviews. I mean, interviews are really fun to read and fun to do. So
Why are interviews not taken seriously as a form of high art?
you don't think
No, I don't. I think they're taken particularly like and I don't mean necessarily, Frank Sinatra has a cold style, expository pieces about interviews. I'm talking about like the straight up conversation, the transcript of this conversation, right? And edit for length and clarity if you want, but really like the exchange between Ben and Emily to me is the most fascinating thing. And I think there are lots of people who go, no, that's just two people talking. There's nothing revelatory in that. And I just think that's totally wrong.
I guess I've always really, I've always been more in the like Warhol school of
Same.
of like recorded text, and I'm probably more aligned with you than with the fictional interlocutor in this case. But I guess also like now that it's so easy to record and transcribe text, like there is more junk around. I guess I wouldn't necessarily just want to listen to any old.
Yeah, I don't.
Well,
yeah, no. I look. I agree with you 100% about that. But I feel like this is a belief that has been held for a long time, and that it's in magazine journalism or in newspaper journalism, whatever. The conversation is a lesser form than the expository profile, or whatever the case is.
The idea that like the spoken word is less valuable or trustworthy, or the idea that there's this relationship. I guess the written word was thought to be less trustworthy than the spoken word, but then has taken on a different form of value in different contexts. Like this is one of like the oldest themes in like literary theory. This is like this dichotomy between the spoken word and the written word has been a theme for thousands of years. So I think it, probably has something to do with that. And the idea that like, people have a lot of attachment to the idea of like an artisanal crafted sentence. I mean, this is what we're seeing a lot with a lot of the anxiety around AI generated text. So in addition to my strategy and trend forecasting work, I run a literary press called Deluge Books, and we publish literature. And I published a book called A More Cringe by K. Alato McDowell, where the author intentionally blended their own writing with writing generated by an AI. So they were writing a story, they were using a large language model to help generate the story, and then they would fill in parts themselves and write certain parts of it, and they kind of intentionally let it get messy in their own conception. And then the book is framed this way, and there's no typographical difference. Sorry, there's some background noise here.
I'm not getting it. You're perfect. Don't worry about it.
The like, there's no sense when you're reading the book of what's what. It's just like you're aware of the fact that it's partially AI generated and partially man-made, human written.
Right.
And then one story, it's like it's one tale. And there's actually it's a huge mind fuck, because you can't really trust that anything you're reading is necessarily, one or the other.
Yeah.
But what's fun about it is that it's like, I actually find it easier to pay attention to than when I know for a fact that like an entire text is AI generated, and then I start to kind of like rush through it, but I definitely notice like there's this enormous attachment to the idea of the crafted sentence, and I think that that's also sort of what you're reacting to in terms of the like, there's like the crafted written piece of journalism versus the transcript, and the transcript is more in line with the AI or something.
Yeah. Maybe. It's funny. I've been, since I started doing this interview series on Riverside, I've been talking about this a lot. Like so this, what will happen is we'll hang up, in 15 minutes and go our separate ways. And the AI will send me a transcript of this conversation, and every proper noun in it will be wrong. Like categorically, and then beyond that, I will then have to. I will spend a bunch of time cleaning up the proper nouns, and then the little turns of phrase and the things that it didn't quite catch, and all of that sort of stuff. Not because I'm a copy editor, I am not, and there will still be lots of mistakes in there, but because it just feels like if I'm going to bother having a transcript or closed captions or whatever, I'd like them to at least be reflective of what's being said, as opposed to being totally wrong. Now, on the one hand, transcribing the thing would have been an incredible pain in the ass, and I never would have done it. So I'm very happy to have this thing. By the same token, putting in the extra work is a task that I never had before. And so my efficiency has created this inefficiency. And that to me is kind of the AI problem in a nutshell, right? It's like for every solution it creates another problem that is maybe incrementally smaller, but is nonetheless a new problem. And you're just like,
it's true. It's just sort of how it crumbles, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, are you, so I did not read, that book. I read your book, but I didn't read that one. Although I did follow it with a lot of interest, and, receive all of the details on it from Deluge, and I will certainly go back to it and check it out. As a work, did you find, I mean, you published it, right? So you must have found it compelling, but did you find it good, or was it more compelling than good? And this is not to have anybody throw shots. It's just, you know what I mean? I'm interested to know.
I did find it good. And which is not to say that I think would find every book written with this method good. I found it to be an interesting method, also from a writer who's been working with writing through large language models for years. So there was a certain amount to the investigation. And then this, where, this happened to be, this was just one way of doing it. Like their first book in this vein is a dialogue with the AI. So it's very clearly marked which is which. And then there's a third book that switches off between regular man-made writing and AI writing, but typographically marks which is which. In which case, I actually found myself, despite myself, skipping over the AI parts.
Oh, interesting.
And just human parts. So, but this is all to say, this is coming from like a very long, very thoughtful, very skilled, deep investigation into what it means to write with this technology. And then it also just so happens that I thought the results were good and compelling on their own. And then it's sort of like, on top of it, there's the mind fuck of knowing that it's written in this unusual way and you don't know what's what. And it is kind of asking you to regard it in a different way than you would a regular novel that you pick up. And I liked that about it.
Yeah. No, I mean, just as a pure sort of intellectual exercise, theoretical pursuit, novelty, reason to exist, it's awesome. Yeah, but having not read it, I can't judge it. So I'm interested. I'm interested.
Tell me if you think it's good.
Okay, I will. It's funny. Speaking of that sort of collaboration of I've been telling this story a lot recently. So I have along with the 17-year-old who I mentioned earlier, I have a 14-year-old, and we did parent-teacher conferences recently, and her English teacher was telling me, well, Harper is doing a good job this semester. She got deducted some points recently on an exercise because she did some work on it out of class. And I didn't really understand what that meant. I was like, well, okay, so you mean she did some like editing or improvement to it later and then turned it back in? She said, well, yeah, it's done as like a Google Doc, and students that manipulated their work outside of class time got deducted points because we have to presume that they're using AI to manipulate the text. Whether or not my daughter did that, I'm pretty sure she didn't, but irrespective, I just thought that was sort of a fascinating, and that has fascinating implications on education in the future. It's just like, yeah, now there will never be homework again because homework is cheating. And, it's just, it's amazing. But I think where we have to find ourselves is in dialogue, in co-creation with these things, in the way that Carlotta did.
Some teacher, and I wish I could remember their name. I saw someone on Twitter saying, like, a professor, I think it was at a college level, saying, like, I allow my students to use ChatGPT in their essays, but they have to show me the prompt, and the prompt has to be at least 500 words long and use at least 3 examples from primary sources. And I thought that was so cool.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's probably, pedagogically correct in terms of using the prompt like a footnote and citing it. The 500 words prompts seems,
or I don't know if that's exactly what it said.
It's a long prompt.
The point is more to say that, like, I think embracing it to some degree and showing that there's thought that can also go into the prompt. I mean, I think the idea that homework is cheating is probably good. I went to, like, a fancy private school in New York and had an insane amount of homework and totally drank the Kool-Aid and felt super compelled to, like, do all of it. And I got a great education, but it was way too stressful for a child. And I just don't think that kids need to be educated that way. And I think it would have been amazing if I didn't have to do homework.
Yeah.
So
well,
homework was considered cheating. I think that would have been very, like, therapeutic for me.
Yeah. Well, there you go. I mean, there's the clickbait headline from this conversation: is homework is cheating, says August trend forecaster. But well, yeah, I don't know. I find that out. I also want to know about Deluge a little bit. Is Deluge still like an active project on a ongoing basis?
We haven't put out as many books in the last year. We put out 5 books kind of pretty quickly, and then we've been in a more, like, research and development phase where we have a bunch of projects going on behind the scenes that weren't ready to come out. So it's been a minute since we've put out a book. But it came from sort of, like, conversation between me and a couple of friends. We all had written our first books around the same time, and we were trying to navigate the publishing landscape. And one of them had gotten, like, a big book deal, and so had that experience. Was happy with certain parts of it, not happy with other parts of it. And another friend published through a very, very tiny and zine press, which was a great experience in certain ways, but then also didn't really deliver in others. And so out of this sort of, like, Goldilocks like desire for trying to find the right way to put books out, especially because it happened during COVID lockdown when a lot of small businesses were crashing, and it seemed hard to trust that if you put your book in the hands of a smaller publishing company, they'd be able to even, like, see it through. I started researching different models and discovered print on demand and realized that print on demand is a very, like, looked at as a very, like, shameful, low value thing. But I thought it would be kind of like streetwear, where, like, maybe just putting, like, a decal on a Gildan sweatshirt, like, if you did it with the right design ethos and with enough, like, swag and thoughtfulness, could, like, actually be cool.
Yeah.
And then there are tons of really amazing things about print on demand in that, it obviously is better for the environment not to overproduce. It's great that you can sort of start a project like this without having to invest in having, like, a huge amount of, like, physical stock that you have to care for. And it also meant that we could be accessible to different booksellers all around the world kind of instantly, which was really amazing.
That's interesting, actually. Yeah, I mean, everything else that you've
order our books, and yeah.
No, sorry for interrupting. Everything you said up to being available for booksellers all at once tracks and was a part of what I figured you would say. The being available all at once thing is I mean, that's smart, and that's not to say the rest of it isn't smart. It's all smart, but you know what I'm saying? Like that's a facet I hadn't considered, and really sort of puts it over the top from a logic perspective, I think. That's cool. And then, and so and do you feel like, project like streetwear as publishing model is like, has it worked out the way you kind of expected it to or hoped it would?
I think it's worked pretty well. I think like anything, I had like a really like blessed amount of naivete going into it. So I was like, it's gonna be so fucking easy. Like people are like, and books are kind of like hard and slow objects in a way. Like they're meant to be like that. They're not really like part of why we love books is that like a lot of work goes into making them.
Sure.
And there are still like logistical complications, even though we have a much better than usual system for printing and distributing. That, if I was trying, it would be impossible for me to do it the old fashioned way, but even in the newfangled way, there's still like logistical complications that come through it. So I've come down to earth a little bit with it, but it's been an amazing experience, and it's been very inspiring for all of the people involved, in the sense that when you're trying to I mean, I've definitely seen a lot of friends in the music world kind of deal with this for years. Like, how
Sure.
do you figure out how to navigate an industry that's like very, very broken and very disincentivized toward the people making the content?
Yeah.
Like, and music, this has been the case for a very long time, and we've seen so many different ingenious ways that different artists have tried to deal with it. And so in a way, this is like kind of like an artist having their own music, their own label, which has become like more and more of a way to navigate things, but is much less common in the world of books because of the technical constraints, but also kind of like it being just like a very slow and old-fashioned.
Yeah, there's a lot of orthodoxies that are,
and people are very, very attached to the prestige that comes through old world publishing structures, which I totally get. And if any of that prestige fell in my lap, I would probably feel amazing and love it. So no shade to anyone who's enjoying the spoils of that prestige. But at the same time, I was trying to think about like, trying to do something different that felt more in line with my values. And then also like kind of applying things that I've learned from other industries to the book world.
Sure.
It's been really cool. It's been really cool. It's been amazing. And I'm excited for kind of like Deluge season 2 when we really get hot and heavy putting out a bunch of new books, which will hopefully happen in the next year and a half.
Okay, good. Well, listen, we're kind of coming up on the hour mark, so I should let you go so you can do that, plan the deluge, but also would love to have you come back and give an update on that at some point in the future. Because this has been really fun, and Emily, like I said, I'm every time I encounter your work, I'm inspired by it, whether it's stuff that's old or whether it's stuff that's brand new. I can't wait for B to Z and the rest of the A to Z installment, and just generally what you guys are doing for Nemesis. And I think, anybody listening, it is worth the time to investigate Emily's work and Nemesis and everything else. So thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. All right. Well, we will talk again soon, but everybody, thanks for listening, for tuning in. This has been SIC Talks number 73, and I will see you again next week. All right. Bye.